Go and look at a jar of honey, read the ingredients. There aren't any. That is not an oversight, and it is not a gap in the labeling law. It is the entire point of the product. Honey is one of the very few things in a British supermarket that is legally not allowed to contain anything else. Under the regulations, honey means the natural sweet substance produced by bees from the nectar or secretions of plants, stored in honeycombs to ripen and mature. And if any additive or any other ingredient has been added to it, it may not be called honey. Not honey product, not honey blend. It simply forfeits the word. One ingredient, one word. No wriggle room in the definition at all. Which is precisely why it is the most attacked food in the world. Because think about the position that puts a fraudster in. In every other episode of this series, the deception has had to work around a product, a farm name attached to real chicken, a storage room slowing down a real apple, an oven finishing a real loaf. The food itself was always what it claimed to be. Honey is the first product in this series where the fraud is the product. Where what is in the jar is not honey that has been misdescribed. It is sugar syrup wearing honey's name. Between November 2021 and February 2022, the European Commission ran a coordinated operation. 320 consignments of honey, imported from 20 countries, sampled at the border, sent to the Commission's Joint Research Centre and put through a battery of advanced analytical testing. The results were published on the 23rd of March 2023 under the title From the Hives. 147 of those 320 consignments, 46%, were flagged as suspected of being adulterated. Nearly half of everything they pulled off the border and tested. And I want to be clear about how that sampling worked, because it changes what the number means. These were not tip-offs. This was not a raid on suspects. The consignments were selected randomly at the point of import before anyone knew what was in them. Nobody went looking for the bad ones, which means the 46% is not a hit rate on suspicious shipments. It is close to a snapshot of the flow, and if you pick nearly at random from a river and half of what you catch is wrong, the problem is not in the sample. The problem is in the river. And I need to tell you the United Kingdom figure now because it is in the title of this video and I'm not going to make you wait for it and then dress it up. 10 consignments were sampled that came from the UK. 10 out of 10 were flagged. 100%. The highest suspicion rate of any country in the entire operation. Now, stop, because this is the part where a less careful channel would run away with that number, and I'm not going to, because the explanation matters more than the headline, and it is genuinely worse than the headline suggests. The Commission was explicit about what those UK consignments were. They were, in its assessment, honey likely produced in other countries, brought into the United Kingdom, blended here, and then re-exported into the European Union. So that 100% is not a verdict on British beekeepers. British beekeepers are not in this story as villains at any point, and I want that said clearly and early. The honey in those 10 consignments almost certainly never went near a British hive. But read what it actually describes, because when I worked it through, I found it far more troubling than the simple reading. It describes this country operating as a laundering step. A shipment arrives from somewhere. It is blended here, and it leaves again with a new origin attached, a British one, carrying a reputation for regulatory seriousness that the product itself does not deserve. The value that Britain added to those consignments was not processing. It was plausibility. That is the video. Not your honey is fake. Something more specific and more interesting, how a single ingredient food became the most adulterated commodity in the global food trade, and what happens at the point where the paperwork changes hands. There are two other things I want you to hold on to. The first is a technique. There is a step performed on some imported honey that removes the one physical feature capable of proving where it came from. Not obscures. Removes? I will explain what it is and why it is the exact same trick as the one we found in the fish video. The second is a single sentence from the European Anti-Fraud Office's findings that I have read probably 30 times now, and which I think is the single most chilling line in this entire series so far. It describes something the operators were doing that is not adulteration. It is something one step beyond adulteration. I will read it out in full later, and before the technique, the rest of the map, because I gave you the UK number first, and that is only one line in the table. Of the 20 exporting countries covered, 2 dominate the findings. China accounted for the largest absolute number of suspicious consignments. Around 74% of the suspicious shipments in the operation trace back to Chinese origin. That reflects volume as much as anything. China is the largest honey producer and exporter on Earth by a very wide margin, so it will be the largest contributor to almost any category. Turkey produced the highest proportional rate of any major exporter. 93% of the Turkish samples tested were flagged. And the operators themselves were measured, not just the shipments. 57% of the operators examined had exported at least one suspicious consignment containing extraneous sugars. 66% had imported at least one, 2/3, which tells you this is not a handful of criminals at the edge of a clean industry. On these numbers, contact with suspect product was closer to the norm than the exception across the operators sampled, including necessarily companies that had no idea, because when the paperwork is forged upstream, the honest importer downstream is simply another victim holding a document. Now, how do you actually fake honey? And to understand why it is worth doing, you have to understand what real honey costs to make. A honeybee colony produces honey by collecting nectar, which is mostly water, and then removing that water. Foragers bring nectar back to the hive, it is passed between bees, enzymes are added that break the complex sugars down, and then the colony fans it, thousands of wings for days, until the moisture content falls low enough that the honey will not ferment. Only then is the cell capped with wax. The scale of that is worth sitting with. A single worker bee produces a fraction of a teaspoon of honey in her entire life. A jar on a shelf represents the combined foraging of a colony across an enormous number of flower visits and a very large distance flown. Now compare that to the alternative. A syrup refinery takes rice or wheat or sugar beet, applies enzymes and heat, and produces tons of sweet viscous liquid per shift for a small fraction of the cost. That is the entire economics of honey fraud in 2 paragraphs. On one side, an insect and a season. On the other, an industrial process running continuously. The margin between them is the prize, and it is very large. You do not, in the main, dilute it with water. That is crude, and it fails immediately because honey has a defined moisture ceiling and water changes its density and its behavior. What you do is add sugar syrup. Syrup is cheap, it is sweet, it is viscous, and once it is mixed thoroughly into real honey, the resulting liquid looks, pours, and tastes close enough that no human being can identify it in a kitchen. There is no taste test. There is no jar test. The much repeated folk methods, the water test, the thumb test, the flame test, whether it crystallizes, are as detection tools close to worthless, and I would rather tell you that than sell you a trick that doesn't work. So it comes down to laboratories. And the story of honey fraud over the last 20 years is genuinely an arms race with a clear and rather brilliant turning point. Before that, 30 seconds. The Food Ledger UK is a new channel. This episode is built on a European Commission Joint Research Centre analysis, the EU Anti-Fraud Office's investigative findings, UK honey regulations, EU legislative documents, and analytical chemistry literature. All of it public. Practically none of it read by anybody who buys honey. I am trying to get to 5,000 subscribers. Not 100,000, 5,000. That is where this becomes sustainable enough to keep doing properly. If you did not know what is in the next section before today, press subscribe. It costs nothing, and it is the difference between this continuing and this quietly stopping. 5,000. Now the arms race, and it starts with photosynthesis. Plants split into 2 broad groups depending on how they fix carbon. The technical names are C3 and C4, and the practical consequence is this. C4 plants and C3 plants incorporate the 2 natural isotopes of carbon in slightly different ratios. Carbon-12 and carbon-13 end up in measurably different proportions depending on which photosynthetic pathway made the sugar. Sugarcane and maize are C4 plants. The nectar-producing plants that bees work are overwhelmingly C3. So somebody realized that if you take honey and measure its carbon isotope ratio, you can detect the presence of cane or corn syrup, because those syrups carry a C4 signature that honey should not have. The technique is called stable carbon isotope ratio analysis, and it became the standard test. It was elegant, it was hard to argue with, and for years it worked. And then the industry that was being tested read the paper, because that test has a blind spot, and the blind spot is enormous. It detects C4 sugars. It cannot detect syrups made from C3 plants, beet, rice, wheat, because those carry the same isotopic signature as the honey itself. Put rice syrup into honey and the standard test sees nothing at all. Not a reduced signal. Nothing. And that is exactly what happened. The Joint Research Centre stated it plainly in its findings. Sugar syrups made from maize are now rarely used to extend honey. They have been replaced by syrups made mostly from rice, wheat, or sugar beet. Read that as what it is. That is not a change in fashion or in cost. That is a whole industry migrating in a body away from the adulterant that the test can see and toward the adulterants it cannot. The detection method did not stop the fraud. It selected for a smarter version of it, in almost exactly the way that overusing an antibiotic does not eliminate bacteria, it just leaves you with the resistant ones. So the laboratories moved again. The current front line is nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy, which does something categorically different from the isotope test. Rather than asking one question, is there a C4 signature, NMR produces what is best described as a molecular fingerprint of the whole sample, reading a large number of parameters at once and matching that fingerprint against databases of samples that have been independently authenticated. The strength of that approach is precisely that it is not one question. You can engineer a syrup to defeat one parameter. Defeating dozens simultaneously while still producing something that pours and tastes like honey is a genuinely hard problem. And the Joint Research Centre said this itself, and I think it is important that a European Commission body said it out loud. Current analytical methods are not yet sufficiently developed at international level, and a simple test is not sufficient to detect adulteration. The people doing the testing are telling you the testing is not finished. Now I want your help because I cannot check every jar in Britain and you can. Here is the task, and it takes about 15 seconds. Go to your cupboard and pick up whatever honey you own. Turn the jar around and find the country of origin. It is legally required to be there. Then tell me in the comments exactly what it says, word for word, and whether you had to hunt for it. I am specifically looking for how many of you find a named country and how many find the phrase blend of honeys from more than one country, or an older wording along the same lines. I read these properly, and material from every episode of this series so far has ended up in my research notes. And answer me one more thing, because I genuinely want to know. Had you ever assumed the honey in your cupboard was British? Most people I have asked said yes without thinking about it. Say what you assumed. Right. Now the sentence I promised you. The Anti-Fraud Office investigated 44 operators across the European Union involved in processing, blending, and packing honey. 7 of them were sanctioned. And among the malpractices documented were the use of sugar syrups, the use of additives and colorings to falsify botanical origin, and the forging of traceability documents to mask geographical origin. And this, the use of laboratory analysis to adapt honey and sugar blends so as to evade detection. Read it again. They were testing their own adulterated honey, running it through the same analytical methods the regulators use, checking whether it would pass, and if it would not, adjusting the formulation until it did. That is a fundamentally different activity from cheating. Cheating is doing the wrong thing and hoping nobody looks. This is building an in-house quality control function whose defined output is a product that passes inspection while not being the thing it claims to be. It is a laboratory dedicated to the manufacture of undetectability, and it explains the migration from C4 to C3 syrups completely. That was not luck. Somebody tested, found the failure mode, and engineered around it. And I want to answer the obvious question before the comments do, because it is a fair one. Does any of this actually hurt anybody, or is it purely theft? Mostly it is theft, and I'm not going to inflate it. Rice syrup is not poison. Somebody eating adulterated honey on toast is, in the great majority of cases, eating sugar they did not intend to buy at a price they should not have paid. But there are 3 real edges to it. The first is that people buy honey for specific reasons. A shopper choosing honey over sugar for a child, or for a sore throat, or because they are trying to avoid refined syrups, has made a deliberate decision about what goes into their body. And adulteration takes that decision away from them and hands it to somebody they will never meet. Whether or not you think that decision is scientifically well-founded, it was theirs to make. The second is that adulteration is not always the only thing arriving. Where supply chains are opaque enough to permit syrup and forged paperwork, they are opaque enough to permit other things too. Historic honey enforcement cases internationally have turned up residues of veterinary antibiotics used in beekeeping that are not permitted in food. That is a real regulatory concern, and it is precisely why border testing exists. And the third is the one that will outlast all of us. Every jar of cheap fake honey competes directly against a real beekeeper who has to keep colonies alive through winter, through disease, through pesticide exposure, and through weather. Fraud does not merely take money from consumers. It sets an artificial floor price that honest producers cannot meet, and it does that in a sector we happen to need for reasons that have nothing to do with breakfast. Which brings me to pollen, and to the thing that connects this episode directly to the last one. Real honey contains pollen, microscopic grains picked up by bees carried back to the hive suspended in the honey. And pollen is not a contaminant. Pollen is the honey's passport because the pollen species present in a jar of honey record which plants the bees actually visited, and therefore, with real precision, where in the world that honey was made. The discipline that reads it is called melissopollinology, and it has been used for decades to verify geographic and botanical origin, which means pollen is the one component of honey that cannot be faked by adjusting a recipe. It is physical evidence of place, so it gets removed. Among the practices the investigation documented was pollen removal, alongside forged documentation, specifically as a means of masking geographical origin. Filter the honey aggressively enough, and the pollen goes. What is left is chemically still honey, yes, but it is honey with no memory of anywhere. And now think back to the fish video because it is precisely the same move. A whole fish has a head, eyes, gills, fins, and skin, a complete set of features that identify the species beyond argument. Remove them, cut what is left into a rectangle, and you have a product that can be called anything. Honey with its pollen removed is a fillet with no face. That is the actual technique underneath this entire series, and it took me 7 episodes to see it clearly. It is not lying. It is the removal of the features that would allow a lie to be caught. In every single case, the tin with no factory address, the chicken with an invented farm, the apple with no harvest date, the loaf with no ingredients list, the fillet with no head, the honey with no pollen, somebody has stripped out the identifying information first and only then made the claim. You cannot contradict a label with a fact that no longer exists. So what does the label actually have to tell you? For pre-packed honey in this country, the name of the product, the name and address of the responsible business, a best before date, the net quantity, storage conditions where relevant, and the country or countries in which the honey was harvested. That last one is genuinely a real requirement, and it is better than what most foods get. But look at the permitted wording when honey has been blended from multiple sources. The label may say, blend of honeys from more than one country. That is it. That is the whole disclosure. More than one country. Out of roughly 200. It does not have to say which countries. It does not have to say how many. It does not have to say in what proportions. A jar that is 99% from one origin and 1% from another, and a jar assembled from 8 origins on 4 continents, carry identical wording. And that matters here more than almost anywhere else because Britain does not produce most of its own honey. On the estimates I have seen, something in the region of 80 to 90% of the honey consumed in this country is imported. The British Hive supplies a small minority of the British breakfast table, which means the blend label is not an edge case in this market. It is the normal case. Now this is changing, in the European Union at least, and the shape of the reform tells you exactly what the regulators concluded was wrong. Under the amended rules agreed for honey, the country of origin must appear on the front of the pack, near the brand name. Where the product is a blend from several countries, those countries must be listed in descending order of quantity, with percentage ranges by weight. Each honey placed on the market must carry an identifier code linked to a traceability system so that authorities can follow the chain all the way back to the beekeepers. An EU reference laboratory for honey is to be established, and the Commission is to adopt a harmonised methodology for determining origin and authenticity. Look at what each of those fixes. Front of pack because the disclosure was hidden. Descending order and percentages because more than one country concealed the proportions. Traceability codes back to the beekeeper because the paperwork was forgeable. A reference laboratory and a harmonised method because, as the Commission's own scientists said, the tests were not good enough and everyone was using different ones. That is a regulator reading its own investigation and closing each hole it found, one at a time. Whether the United Kingdom follows and how closely is at this point an open question and one worth asking of whoever represents you. And now the fairness section because this channel is worthless if it only reports one side. The findings have been contested. Industry bodies representing honey producers and traders have pushed back hard on the methodology of the coordinated action, arguing about the reliability and reproducibility of the newer analytical techniques, about the absence of internationally agreed standards for those methods, and about the fact that suspicious is not the same as proven adulterated. That last point is not a quibble, and I want to be straight about it. The 46% figure describes samples flagged as suspected of non-compliance, not 46% proven guilty in a court. I think the criticism has some force on the science and much less on the substance. When 147 of 320 consignments raise a flag, when 57% of operators had exported at least one suspicious consignment and 66% had imported one. When the Anti-Fraud Office sanctioned 7 operators after investigating 44, and when the documented practices include forging traceability paperwork and stripping out pollen. The picture does not turn on whether one spectroscopic method is fully validated yet, but you should know the argument exists, and you should weigh it. That is your job, not mine. So here is the method. How to buy honey you can actually stand behind. First, and this is the big one, buy from a named beekeeper or a named apiary as close to you as you can get. Not because local honey is magic. The claims about local honey and hay fever are not well supported, and I'm not going to repeat them, but because a named producer with a small operation is a supply chain with one link in it. Every problem in this video is a problem of length. Remove the length and you remove the problem. Second, read the origin line before you buy, not after. If it says blend of honeys from more than one country, you now know precisely how much information that sentence contains, which is almost none. Third, prefer a single named country to a blend, and treat a named region or a named blossom as better still, because a botanical or regional claim legally requires the honey to come wholly or mainly from that source, which is a much harder thing to assert falsely than more than one country. Fourth, understand what the reserved words mean, because some of them are genuinely defined. Comb honey, chunk honey, pressed honey, drained honey, filtered honey, and baker's honey all have specific legal meanings. Notice in particular that baker's honey is a real legal category for honey that is not up to table standard. And notice that raw, pure, natural, and artisan are not on that list at all. Fifth, adjust your expectations about price honestly. Honey is made by insects, one nectar load at a time, and a jar of it represents a genuinely large amount of work by a colony. When the price of a jar sits well below what that work could plausibly cost, that gap has to have come from somewhere. Sometimes it is scale, sometimes it is syrup. And sixth, the free one, stop trusting the picture on the front. A hive, a meadow, a bee, a wooden dipper, a hexagon pattern. None of those is a claim, none of them is regulated, and all of them are doing the job that the origin line on the back is legally required to do and is permitted to do badly. Which leaves one more door, and it is the last one I will open this week. We have now done 7 of these: dairy, the pantry, meat, fresh produce, bread, fish, and honey. And the pattern I described earlier, remove the identifying feature first, make the claim second, holds in every single one. So I went looking for the product where that pattern is most extreme, where the gap between what the label promises and what can be verified is the widest of anything in a European supermarket. It is a liquid. It is green gold. It comes in a bottle, and it carries a 2-word description that sounds like a legal guarantee and functions as one. There is a defined grade, there are chemical parameters, there is a tasting panel, and a product either meets the standard or it does not. And it is by a distance the most investigated food fraud in Europe. There have been criminal prosecutions. There have been seizures measured in thousands of tons. There have been laboratory studies where a majority of the samples tested did not meet the grade printed on the bottle. And over the last few years, catastrophic harvests and record prices have applied more pressure to that supply chain than at any point in living memory. And pressure on a supply chain is, as we have now seen 7 times, exactly when the syrup goes in. Extra virgin olive oil. That is the next page of the ledger. What the grade legally means, why so much of it fails, what they cut it with, and the one thing you can do at your own kitchen table to test the bottle you already own. Before then, go and read the back of your honey jar. Word for word. Bring it to the comments. And the next time you pick up a jar with a picture of a meadow on it and no ingredients list at all. Remember that the empty ingredients list is not proof of purity. It is just the absence of a place to write anything down. The food ledger is open.